حسين حسين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. My dear brothers, sisters, respected scholars, elders, from wherever you are watching from around the globe, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now today we are back with another episode from the series They Ask You. And in today's episode, we are discussing the topic of dua literature from the period of the Imams till Shaykh Abbas al-Qummi. Now, as Shia Muslims, we are lucky to have a variety of du'as and supplications which are available to us. Dua is described as the weapon of a believer. So in today's episode, we will be looking closely at dua literature, and without a doubt, this is going to be a very interesting, beneficial and fruitful discussion, inshallah. So there's a lot to get through. So without any further delays, let's jump right into the topic. I am your host, Zahra al-Alawi, and today joining us all the way from Toronto, Canada, is Sheikh Vinay Khetia. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
It's great to have you back and to benefit from ample of knowledge, inshallah, that you will be offering us. To begin with, as I said in the introduction, that as Shia and Muslims, we have a variety of du'as and supplications which are available to us, and I believe it's unparalleled too. So to begin the discussion, what is du'a?
Well, du'a is it's an Arabic word which literally means to call, right? From da'awa, da'a, and it's quite beautiful because it is calling upon, right? It doesn't mean prayer per se. It is a calling upon. There's da'a, nida, nada, to cry out, but da'a is different. It's to call upon someone, right? So for example, if you invite someone, you would say da'autuk, I invited you. Where?
Yeah.
Right? Da'autuka ila bayti, I invited you to my house. But it is a call. You're calling upon someone, right? So when you call upon someone, you're awaiting an answer from them. It has a very beautiful usage in the Quran, and it's used in so many different verbal tenses in the Quran as well. But it can be equivocated to prayer, to a form of prayer, a form of invocation, that they're invoking the name of God, or supplicating to God. Supplicating meaning a prayer. And a dua normally entails two things. It entails the one that is being addressed. So it's clear as to who is being addressed. And then it's followed by some sort of a request. Some kind of a request normally. Otherwise, it would be sometimes just simply described as thana, or praise. Although, I mean, these are not set definitions, but they kind of give us an idea of what it entails. And there is normally, or for a longer supplication, there is an introductory part which describes the attributes of the one that is being called upon. That before the request, the attributes of the one that is being called upon are being described. So, for example, when somebody would go to meet a very righteous person or a powerful person, they'll begin with their title. You are so-and-so, king of so-and-so, king of this land, the owner of this land. You are the, this noble person, so-and-so, so and so forth. All these descriptions. And then, okay, well, what have you come here for? What's your purpose? Yeah. But there's an introduction to that discussion or to that request. There's a kind of preamble. And dua contains both of these things.
Interesting. I don't think I've heard it being described in that way. It's a very, very interesting way of describing it. Would you also say it's a form of communication as well with the Lord?
Of course, it's a form of communication. It's you're calling upon something or someone, and you are hoping for a response from that person. So it is a two-way communication, except when speaking to a divine entity or God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that response is not in the way that you may comprehend, but there is a response. So there is, dua entails entering literally into a relationship with God.
Yeah.
Either way, it's a communicative relationship with God. And it is something that is also magical. It's magical because on one hand, there is this belief in an unseen, all-powerful being that controls everything in the universe, the creator of everything. Yet here I am, or here you are, this tiny little speck, not even a speck within the timeline of history, both quantitatively and qualitatively.
Yeah.
Yet this tiny speck of nothing is entering into a communicative relationship with the all-powerful creator who created time to begin with.
SubhanAllah.
So this mutual relationship is really one of love.
Yeah.
It is one of love, because if without God loving us, there was no reason to respond to us anything. Are we worthy of the response really if we compare who we are to what he is? But it's magical for this reason, because there is two things that kind of come into play here. Number one is the very fact that we would initiate a conversation or a dialogue with something that's unseen. Yeah. Unseen and all-powerful, giving us a sense of profound significance within ourselves. Number two, the very fact that this conversation could influence ourselves, the universe, and the afterlife. Yeah. That there's a ta'thir, there's an effect. There's a possible effect of this, right? If the supplication, right? So this is what we call the devotional path, the path of devotion. And every religion, almost every religion, survives because of devotion. Yeah. Religions don't survive out of books of jurisprudence and theology and scholastic hermeneutics and exegesis and things like that. That's for the specialized class of people, a very, very specialized group of people who dive deep into the books that you can see in the background there and spend their life opening them and reading them and editing them. And that's important too. But a life of devotion, the door of devotion is open to anybody.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful way to describe it. So are there types of du'as in other religious traditions? And if so, can you introduce this phenomena?
Yeah, you see, this practice perhaps goes back to the Egyptians, actually. We see in the history that the word for prayer in hieroglyphics, at least in some of the early pieces that have been recovered from ancient Egypt, is the hands together. So there was already a concept of supplication as indicative of begging, pleading before a supreme power, which was at that time the creator of the sun and the moon and the earth. So this conception of supplication, of private and personal supplication, can be traced back to the ancient Egyptians. ancient Egypt, when they're writing in hieroglyphics. In fact, there was, during graduate school many years ago, by many years ago, I probably mean this was like maybe like 8-9 years ago, I remember a professor of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics coming in as a visiting prof at that time in our seminar, in our doctoral seminar. And he presented on the concept of supplication in ancient Egypt. This is, I would think, maybe contemporary to the beginning of Judaism, before maybe even Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And they had these beautiful prayers like du'as, really. So this is something that goes back to the very early period of human civilization. It's something that is innate within us. It is something that, I don't know, is it innate or not? I'm making a philosophical proposition here, but it would seem to be something that is relatively innate within us. And something that is very long-standing. Leaving aside the books of scripture for a moment here, whether it be the Torah or the Bible or the Gita or we don't believe Gita is revelation, but Hindus believe it is for them, Quran and things like this. We're just going back to like the early, some what we know of human civilization itself. This concept of entering into communication with something that is so beyond our conception and our understanding and so powerful, yet we're so privileged to enter into a dialogue with this power, this being, this omnipotent force, which can be, again, traced back to ancient Egypt and perhaps even to Akkadian, I don't know, meaning it's just another civilization. It was another ancient language. This is before Hebrew. We're talking Akkadian or maybe contemporary to Hebrew. I don't remember exactly. Akkadian, hieroglyphics. Then, of course, with the rise of the religions of the book, particularly beginning with the Hebrew scriptures, we see a shift occurs in human spirituality, is what we call the shift from human sacrifice to, from a shift from sacrifice to human introspection. What do I mean by this? Human beings, civilizations, and earlier religions used to pray through sacrificing animals at a temple. So this was very important part. This was a prayer. So somebody wanted something done, they would go and sacrifice an animal. This practice goes way back, thousands and thousands of years, fine, which is still performed today in, for example, in Islamic tradition, right? To sacrifice a goat, give it to the poor, hope God accepts it as an offering of charity. But this was pretty much like the main aspect of devotion was sacrifice. It would seem with prophecy and with revealed religion came a new found interest in the self, in turning inwards to the self, and a realization that this self that is within us is something intangible, is something that has come from an intangible, immaterial realm. And now we have to look within ourselves. And when we look within ourselves, how do we vocalize this struggle, this dialectic within ourselves? We vocalize it by turning to the one who has put it within us.
Yeah.
That's prayer. And that's what we call the transference or the shift from sacrifice to self-introspection. Guy Stromsa and others discuss it in a very important work called The End of Sacrifice. And this begins in haste very quickly with the religions of the book. And that's why there's dozens of Hebrew prayers, of early prayers, prayers of petition, prayers of God. What do I do with myself? I have all these problems. I have ignorance. I have all these sins within me. What do I do? How do I fix myself now that our crutch is no longer sacrificing animals only?
Yeah.
we now have this soul that we have to take care of. But the problem is we didn't create the soul. So we're not entirely sure who can fix it for us, except for the one who put it within us, who's a creator of everything, because we know this entity within us has come from an immaterial realm. So now we need to communicate with the immaterial realm in order to figure out what's going on. And this begins very quickly with religions of the book, right? With the Hebrew religions and going forward. And the prototypical example or instance of this would be the Psalms, the Psalter. In the Psalms, these are, or sometimes called the Psalms of David. There's a part of the biblical literature, which are a series of liturgies and prayers. They're prayers of sadness, or prayers of happiness, prayers of repentance, almost like the Sahifa Sajjadiyya that we have today, except thousands of years before, way before the coming of the Sahifa Sajjadiyya. And perhaps that's why William Chittick calls it the Psalms of Islam. And his translation, which I think was done in the 80s of the Sahifa, 80s or 90s, I don't remember now. But so this practice of personal, private, intense, soul-searching supplication goes back thousands of years into human civilization. It's not new with Islam.
SubhanAllah, yeah. And especially when you said that, you know, it could be innate within us. But it's interesting because you mentioned now different kind of religions and different civilizations, but even those who sometimes we see many times that those that perhaps don't even believe in a God or a religion, it's innate within us that if we are in a desperate situation or a time of need, the human calls out for a higher being and enters this kind of communication or this plead or this with a higher being. And although it's not governed by any religious text or anything, it, you know, we see that call out for a higher being. So it's quite interesting that it could pretty much, even without the formation of any religion, it could be innate within a human that when they need something, they do call out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right? I mean, you know, when someone's in trouble, who do they call upon to get their trouble removed, right?
Yeah.
And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it in the Quran, right? That when they're drowning, they call upon God, He saves them, and then they forget that He saved them to begin with from that situation. It is innate, because when we find ourselves in trouble, when we find ourselves in a bind, especially in a life and death situation, you know, I think at that last moment that there's what they call the Hail Mary. Hail Mary chants. I don't know, in North America, it's a Hail Mary, you know, like, for example, in football, you know, they have, in American football, you know, they have something called a punt. They have to kick the ball, right? And it's got to go really far in between those two poles. And it's like at the end, and the ball's all the way at the other end of the field. They're like, might as well kick it. It's a Hail Mary kick. If it goes, it goes. If it reaches, it doesn't reach. We lost, but at least we tried. Okay. So the Quran describes this psychology, this psychological state of desperation, of this Hail Mary, last kind of Hail Mary attempt at some kind of divine intervention in a situation.
Yeah.
But it's often coupled with ingratitude.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because human beings are very quick to forget.
Yes.
Human beings are very quick to forget the numerous times that they've been saved by God.
Absolutely, yeah. It seems like it's a cycle that we keep going back to. But so what makes dua so special? What makes dua literature so special?
Well, we have about 3,800 pieces in our texts.
Wow.
Yeah, we have about 3,000 between the ziyarat and the dua. Ziyarat are much less. We have about 3,800 pieces attributed to the infallibles.
SubhanAllah.
Doesn't mean it's all from them, but we have 3,800 pieces devoted to them or attributed to them. I think it's important when we have 3,800. That's a huge collection.
Would you say the Shia sect has more than other? Yeah?
Shia are known. I remember Ayatollah Sistani and I were discussing this about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, at the beginning of my research. And I remember speaking with Ayatollah Sistani about this, Hafidhullah. And I remember him saying something that, although I never found the reference for it, but I mean, Obviously, he read the reference. I didn't know the reference, but maybe it was in a different manuscript that he had of Ibn Nadim's Fihrist. Ibn Nadim was a biobibliographer of the 5th century, who basically compiled a book about who wrote what, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So basically like an index of books and authors and who those authors are. In there, I remember Ayatollah Sistani telling me that Ibn Nadim described the Shia as Ahlul Dua, the people of supplication. It's very well known because they just had so many, and it's so rich and variegated and different and voluminous as well. As I said, 3,800, and that's a lot. So that takes up many volumes. And it's a huge collection. We have references to this collection in the 7th century by Ibn Tawus as amounting to over 70 volumes that he had of supplication literature. 70 mujallad. Or more. I mean, 70 is, I believe, what he mentioned either in Iqbal al-A'mal or Mahaj al-Da'awat. Ibn Tawus was one of the great experts of supplication who lived around 650, 660 Hijrah. And those were the works that he had up to his time. So yes, it is extremely important. It's something that the Shia community scholars have put an incredible amount of time and effort to preserving and compiling, because it is our connection with God. It is the most poignant manifestation of our spiritual journey.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're left on our own and we don't know how to articulate that spiritual journey. How do we articulate that spiritual journey unless we ourselves are awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, unless we ourselves have that blessing of qurba, of closeness of divine proximity, of proximity to the divine? How do we articulate our spiritual struggles? How do we articulate our spiritual journey? Is it left to everyone to do it on their own in a kind of Protestant style way? I'm not equivocating to, I'm just using it more as a verb here, just as just to describe a phenomenon here of kind of yourself for project. No. So it becomes pivotal for multiple reasons. Reason number one being it's an identity marker of who we are and what we are doing in this world, where we are going in this world, and how the Quran relates to us. Because the supplications many of them are really a mirror of the Quran. It's a form of tafsir of the Quran itself. Because if you look at supplication in the Quran, they become mirror. It's like a mirror of the Quran. So it brings elements of the Quran, elements of the most sacred aspects of our deen, and it verbalizes it into a form of devotion. It's like verbalized belief. That's one thing. And then that becomes an identity marker. That identity marker leads to the building of piety, right? And spiritual identity. And perhaps most importantly, it's a way, it's what I believe Rawandi, Abu Fadl Rawandi, I don't remember exactly, Salwa to Hazin. It becomes a salwa, a consolation. That are sad. He has a book called Salwa to Hazin. It's a whole book on supplication, which is a salwa. Salwa is like a consolation. That when our hearts are broken, the only one that can mend it back together is the one who's created it.
Yeah.
And this becomes so vitally important for our human survival in the midst of the terrible, at times seemingly terrible events that go on in this world. So that's number 3. And number 4 is it has the ability to change our the course of our life here and in the next world.
Yeah.
So it's important for many reasons.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you said that, because it is kind of a sense of a coping mechanism as well, I would say. Especially, you know, my father passed away a couple of months ago, and I think especially to Allah yarhamah, especially to overcome grief, I think supplication dua played a big role in that. And not only, as you said, you know, this world and the hereafter, not only, for example, our supplications will benefit us in terms of overcoming grief, but it will also benefit him who has passed away as well. So I do believe it is, in a sense, it does bring so much peace and solace to an individual, and it could be a coping mechanism in many aspects.
And if I could just add one thing, and perhaps this is I don't say the most important, but a very important part of it is that it's a vital part of our fixing ourselves.
Yeah.
You see, we as human beings are beset with crises after crises. You know, multiple crises. I'm using the word plural here. And usually they're ones of our own making.
Mm.
How do we fix it? We fix it by turning to God in those private moments where we basically come to God and tell God that I am nothing, I am a sinner, I have ruined my life, I have run away from you, as the Imam says in one of the beautiful supplications. He says, I believe Munajat Sha'baniya, he says, Afnaytu ayama shawabi, something like this, that, you know, I wasted away the years of my youth في سكرة تعابد منك في سكرة تعابد منك تعابدي منك, yes, because it's مضاف إليه, that I wasted the years of my life. Here, of course, he's speaking to us in the intoxication of running away from you.
Mm.
And now I've come, you know, basically, الآن يعني حربت منك إليك ووقفت بين يديك, that I've run away from you, but now I'm standing in front of you. And then this whole process of reform begins within ourselves, most importantly. So it's not only a consolation for dealing with things, but it's a consolation for our own crisis within ourselves.
Yes. Absolutely.
And coming out of that, it can inspire a total change in behavior. Dua has the ability and the power and the effect it has a potential effect to change the course of someone's entire behavior.
Yeah.
Of change their relationships, to change everything. That's why it's Silah al-Mu'min, it's the weapon of the believer. And we have 3,800 or so of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amazing. We've spoken about and put emphasis on the importance of dua and its literature and its supplication, but what are its Jewish and Christian heritage, and why does that matter?
Yeah, so I mean, I touched on that a little bit earlier, and it's you see, Islam as being a confirmation of what came before. Is, you know, it's another indication that the path that we're on is the true path. Not that we judge it in comparison to Judaism, Christianity, but my point is that it's the beauty of this is that it's indicative of a common human struggle.
Yeah.
A common, that when we look at our Jewish and Christian or even Hindu brothers and sisters in humanity, or whoever it be, I mean, I'm just giving some examples, and we look at each other and we see we're all in a spiritual struggle of supplication. Everyone wants to cry to God and beg for forgiveness and work on themselves. And supplication, whether it be through the Psalter, through the Psalms, or through other supplication, the biblical ones, the ancient Hebrew ones, so on and so forth. I mean, in the Judaic texts, or even in Hindu literature, for example, or there's this common human struggle, this perennial struggle, this perennial quest for two things: to find meaning in our life.
Mm.
And number two, once we find the meaning, what do we do with it?
Mm.
How do we live it? And when we look at the history of religious traditions, a common stream and thread that runs from the beginning until now is this desire to make meaning of something that is either otherwise meaningless. And supplication, prayer, devotion, calling upon that higher power is vital or foundation to this journey. And that's why I remember, it wasn't Ignatius, it was one of the desert monks who said this. There's a beautiful literature called, the Prayers of the Desert Monks. This is prior to the coming of Islam, that there was a group of monks that lived out in the desert, somewhere in modern day Egypt. They're called the desert monks. And they composed some of the most beautiful supplications in Syriac, which is one of the ancient languages. It's still living today to a certain extent, existing in Syriac. And one of the desert monks, I don't remember the name, Kenneth Leach talks about it in his work on the subject. He says that belief in God basically is it's immaterial without being able to devote oneself to God. That the verbalization of our belief is through our prayer.
Yeah.
And this goes back, way back, to other religious traditions. So my point is that Islam, the beauty of Ahlul Bayt, the beauty of the supplications of Ahlul Bayt, the beauty of what they've put together, the linguistic, spiritual, psychological, irfani, whatever you want to call it, all those different words that come together in their supplications, is like a perfect seal to the struggle and the journey of humankind.
Mm.
And that's why we understand the traditions of Ahlul Bayt in light of the Quran, meaning their supplications in light of the Quran and in light of the human journey that has preceded them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting. Is dua a form of literature, and what is the difference between the two?
Yeah, so liturgy, I mean, this is just a technical matter, so I'll just answer very quickly. We don't have to take up too much time on it. Liturgy is any kind of devotion. So it could be some kind of scripted act of devotion.
Mm.
Okay, so for example, ziyarah is a form of liturgy. People walk towards the shrine, then they recite something before they come inside, then they enter the chamber, they do something, they touch something, they leave, they then do a prayer, perhaps. That's a liturgy. It's a liturgical act.
Okay.
Right? The act of reading from the Quran in our prayer, for example, Surah Fatiha is a liturgical act. It's an act of devotion. Dua is a subcategory of liturgy, but it's a part of liturgy. Mm. It's not an Arabic term, but we use it to try and describe and explain a phenomenon.
Okay, interesting. One more question before we go to a quick break. But so, can you explore the genesis of dua literature? Is it, was it oral? Was it written?
It was oral to begin with, just like the hadith tradition, right? So, and we'll come back to this after the break, that the development of the hadith tradition and the development of dua literature almost exist in tandem.
Okay. So
as the hadith was oral, it was also consecutively written. Dua was oral and then consecutively written.
Okay.
So as Agha Buzurg Tehrani explains in a very important essay, about 8 pages, Agha Buzurg was one of the great masters of hadith and scholars of literature in the city of Najaf. He was a student of Mirza Nuri Tabarsi, Sahib Mustadrak al-Wasail, and a contemporary of Abbas al-Qummi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh. And he describes in this work, and I expand upon this in my dissertation at length, I mean, just taking what he said, I kind of expand upon it, that the science of hadith, or the development of hadith and the writing of hadith, should not be separated from the writing of dua. To go hand in hand. We can discuss that more.
Inshallah. For the audience watching at home, inshallah, we are going off for a quick break. You do not want to miss it, so please do join us after the quick break, where we'll continue discussing the topic of dua literature, inshallah. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Today, access to clean and safe water is still not available in every part of the world. 1 in 10 people don't have access to water close to home. A child dies every 2 minutes due to dirty water. Your donations have been providing life-saving access to water for millions of people around the world. Help us give vulnerable communities access to water. Donate to our Ali Asghar Water Appeal today and help provide clean and safe water to families around the world.
Many people would love to undertake Hausa studies or to learn Arabic, but for most of them, attending a classroom-based program to fulfill that ambition is not a viable option. Introducing Hausa Online. Learn Hausa studies and Arabic from the comfort of your home. From expert teachers with decades of experience and with the blessing of His Eminence Sayyid Ali Husseini Sistani. Visit hausaonline.org.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, and welcome back to our discussion today, where we're discussing dua literature from the time of the Imams until Shaykh Abbas al-Qummi. Now, we had a very, very interesting discussion before the break, and with us is a Shaykh who has written a dissertation on dua literature. It's a very, very interesting discussion. I've been very glued to the screen, and many of us read dua all the time, but we do not look at its origins, its history, and the importance and implications of it. So, inshallah, now we're back to our discussion. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam. So, just as a continuation from our previous discussion about dua, so could you tell us, what is the background to the discussion within the hadith sciences and the history of written material in Islam?
So we see in the early texts, let's divide this up into different stages. Let's say go to the stage of the genesis of this literature. So the genesis of this literature occurs during the historical period of the infallibles, right? So everything up to the lesser occultation, up to the beginning and the end of the lesser occultation. So all the way through, right? Those 250 or so years. This is what we call the period of the Genesis. During this Genesis period, we have a phenomenon known as copying of texts, that there was this importance placed upon copying texts, on preserving them for posterity. And this began from the very early period, perhaps even during the time of the Prophet, slightly after the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we see that there are numerous works going back to the period of the Imams called books of supplication, Kitab al-Du'a, Kutub al-Du'a, Kitab al-Amal al-Yawm, Amal al-Yawm wal-Layla, books for the devotional acts of the day and the night, or Kitab Amal Shahr Ramadan, a book particularly for the devotional acts for the month of Ramadan, or Sha'ban, or Rajab. We find that these titles of these books being attributed to various companions of the Imam, such as Muawiyah ibn Ammar, which indicates to us, and there's other evidence for this as well, that the companions of the Imams were not only interested in compiling the traditions of the Imams with regards to jurisprudence, belief in the Imama, matters dealing with theology, but also in matters dealing with devotion. And this is an important evidence of the existence of written devotional material from the time of the Imams. Salamullahi alayhim. Now, there's another phenomena, or I won't say phenomena, but let's say another development known as the 400 usul, al-usul al-arba'umiyya. These were essentially works that were compiled by the companions of the Imams, which were essentially notebooks of traditions from their sessions with the Imams. So it's like their lecture notes, essentially.
Yeah.
And these companions are many different names, like Zayd Nursi and others. I believe Zayd Nursi was one of them, and others. Now, these individuals are also the transmitters of dua literature. There is a correlation between the two. For example, the Ashab al-Usul, those that were known to be writing tradition, were also the transmitters of certain supplications. And we find this correlation in the isnads, in the chains of transmission that Kulaini has provided in Kitab al-Du'a. We don't need to go so much into the technicalities of it, but this is just one indication of a correlation. It doesn't mean that Ashab al-Usul necessarily wrote down du'as. It just means that what I'm trying to indicate, that there is a correlation between people that were writing down traditions and narrating supplications. So why wouldn't they write down supplications as well? This is in addition to the evidence of the existence of books of supplication from the time of the Imams, and the names of these books have been preserved in texts such as the Fihras of Shaykh Tusi, the Rijal of Najashi, the Fihras, or the Ma'alim of Ibn Shahrashub, and other works like this. One very famous work is Kitab al-Du'a, or Kitab Fardh al-Du'a, of Sa'ad ibn Abdullah al-Ash'ari al-Qummi. He was contemporary to the 10th and 11th Imam, salamullahi alayhima. This book, Sa'ad bin Abdullah al-Ash'ari al-Qummi, was a very important transmitter of hadith. And he was an important connection between Kulaini and earlier reporters of hadith of the A'immah. He was a very famous, pious leader of the Shias in Qum. And he had a book of dua. No doubt this book is extremely important because it would have been based on very earlier sources, and it was a written source from the historical period of the Imams himself. And this book survived well up to the period of al-Qaf'ani, which is somewhere around 700, 800 Hijrah. So from the Imams to Abbas al-Qummi, we have the Genesis period, when this material was transmitted from the Imams, from the Prophet and the Imams, some of it recorded. We then have the preservation stage, beginning with Kulaini and others, putting these supplications into various books. We then have what we call the devotional manual stage, where you start getting books like Mafatih al-Jinan. At the time of Shaykh Tusi, this was a book called Misbah al-Mutahajjid, Wasilah al-Muta'abbid, the lantern of the night worshipper and the weapon of the one who's worshiping, constantly worshiping, Muta'abbid, which was essentially the Mafatih al-Jinan of the 5th century.
Okay.
And he compiled this work, which is a book of A'mal and Dua and Dhikr and Istighfar and Ziyarat for Shahr Rajab, Sha'aban, on and on and on. Kind of like the Mafatih al-Jinan of the 5th century. Except Shaykh Tusi had access to profoundly early sources from the time of the Imams. One, because of his proximity to the time of the Imams. He died in 460 or 460 something Hijrah. And because we know that he had various chains of transmission going to books like Kitab al-Du'a of Muawiyah ibn Ammar, of companions of the 6th Imam or the 7th Imam, 8th Imam, 9th Imam, so on and so forth. So this work was compiled, so this is an example of one of them. This is the abridged version of it called Mukhtasar Misbah al-Fi Amal al-Sana. Fi Amal al-Sana, right?
Yeah.
So this is an example. So he died in 460, let's see, 460 AH there, okay? So, so then we get into the period of specialized devotional texts with people like Tusi, Karajiki, and others, Fadlullah Rawandi perhaps, who could be mixed in there as well. Going then into the 6th, 7th century with Ibn Tawus, who compiled many works on this subject. In the 7th century, Alam al-Hilli was also participated in this, right? So this is what we call the 3rd stage, from the preservation kind of to the specialized manual stage. And that continues all the way until the 20th century with Shaykh Abbas al-Qummi ila yawmina hada, till today.
Amazing, mashallah. We have about 20 minutes left, and I really want to discuss this topic. I think it's very important. And so can you discuss the issue of authenticity and of this material?
So we're going to go back to some of the prefatory material that I've already mentioned.
Okay.
I think there's a couple of preliminary questions that need to be put forward here, which is the question of authenticity. Why does it matter? One, this is the question we have to think about. Does it matter? And if so, how much and why with regards to this literature? This is one question to ask. Second question to ask is this literature to be treated in the way fiqh is treated?
Okay.
And what are the methods for ascertaining or arriving at a reasonable probability that, let's say, Da'a Makarim al-Akhlaq came from Imam Zain al-Abidin? Just for giving an example. So that's the third issue. Fourth issue is then, what evidence do we have to indicate that this literature is from the time of the Imams? So let's begin. Question number one is, does this question matter to begin with?
Yeah.
I think it does, because if we believe that the literature is sacred, that its sacrality, its efficacy, its importance, its power comes from the idea or belief that it originates from an infallible source. I think that's an important part of the equation. So I don't think anyone would debate as to whether the question has some importance to it. But now the follow-up question is, how much do we know about where it's come from, and how much is enough to know? And for this, we have a principle known as at-tasamuh fi adillati sunnah, which is flexibility in dealing with verifying 100% with historical accuracy things that don't pertain to the wajibat or muharramat, let us say, or things that are not of absolute consequence on the Day of Judgment. You're praying to forgiveness to Allah. You're turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're asking God for forgiveness. You're reciting good words. You're describing God's attributes. You're turning to Him, describing yourself as being broken, asking God to help you, describing His beautiful creation. You're not doing anything that's going to harm your soul.
Yeah. So just so does dua always have to come from an infallible, or dua literature, or is it greater if it does come from an infallible, or?
No, dua does not have to come from an infallible. It's much greater if it does, of course, because it's from a sacred source.
Okay.
So it's like the best weapon. If dua is silahul mu'min, the weapon of the believer, then the best weapon comes from an infallible.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So yes, authenticity matters, but it doesn't matter in the way we may think it matters. Okay?
Yeah.
And by looking at the supplications, by looking at their wording, by looking at the kalam of Amir al-Mu'mineen, by looking at the traditions of Ahlul Bayt, we can develop an understanding of the language and develop a dhawq or an experience with the material to know whether it could be from the Imam or not. This is another way. This is when we're missing completely isnads, no historical source, nothing, right? Now, early scholars such as Shaykh Tusi and Ibn Tawus did believe that the question of origins matters, because they go to great lengths to tell us at times that be rest assured that what I'm bringing here is from the Imams. If they didn't think it was important, they wouldn't have told us this. And knowing that we have an abundant number of written sources of supplication from the time of the Imams, this gives us a great sense of tranquility or peace, or I don't know what you want to say, confidence in the fact that a lot of this literature very well may have come from the Imams themselves. And we have examples from the time of the seventh Imam, Du'a Josh and Saghir, which is narrated by Ibn Tawus, but the sanad is very beautiful, and I'll explain just here in a second about why this is important to this question of authenticity. That the companions would come to the seventh Imam, they would be hiding their sleeves, they're hiding their tablets in their sleeves, because this was a time of fear, a time of taqiyya, a time of fear for the Shia at the time of the seventh Imam with relations to the Abbasids. And they would write down what the Imam says. The Imam begins a supplication known as the lesser chainmail supplication, which is a supplication for protection from the enemies. And the companions write it down. This is very important, which indicates to us that this supplication literature was written down. Some of it has very beautiful chains of transmission attached to them. And then the scholars following in subsequent generations taught it to one another, giving licenses to one another to transmit this material, which demonstrates the importance that is placed on this material.
Yeah.
In addition to those texts that we have chains of transmission to, so many of them we don't. For example, in the Misbah al-Mutajjid of the Shaykh Tusi, we don't have chains of transmission for a lot of the material, like Du'a al-Qummi. There is no chain of transmission. There is an earlier source, the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, of a Sunni source that has some elements of Du'a al-Qummi in it, which could indicate it's from an earlier source, but we don't have a chain of transmission for the one that we recite today, an isnad or a sanad for it. But does that mean that Shaykh Tusi got it from nowhere? No, because Shaykh Tusi had sources that were not available to us. We know based on his fihris, on his index and his bibliographical work, or the register of works, that he had access to numerous works from the time of the Imams. And we have confidence in the fact that Shaykh Tusi would have acquired this material from trustworthy sources.
Yeah.
And bringing all of this together, along with the language of the text itself, and ensuring that there's nothing that's against our beliefs, of our established beliefs, it's positive, it's bringing us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then there is no problem in reciting it with the belief that it's from the Imam, and inshallah Allah accepts it.
Inshallah. Well, I think that explains it quite well. Did the Shia scholars place emphasis on dua literature?
Oh, they place so much emphasis on it, right? As I mentioned, from the period of what we call the preservation period, from the period of Kulaini going forward, like, why does Kulaini include in the published edition several hundred pages, or at least a couple of hundred pages, devoted to dua in al-Kafi? Clearly, it was something very important.
Yeah.
And all the subsequent works by the major scholars include, or the scholars that came after, devoted great attention to dua, to the editing, to the writing, to the copying, to the commentary, to the transmission. So teaching it to the students, listening to the recitation of a whole book of supplications or a particular supplication, and then giving a license to the students to transmit it. This is called ijaza or qira'ah, right? We see from the time of Kulaini until Shaykh Abbas Qummi, so this is what, a period of about 1100 years, just a little bit less than 1100 years, let's say, right? No, more than 1100 years. Closer to what, like 1200 years. We see this process of profound emphasis upon the teaching of supplication. For example, Dua Joshin Sahir emanated, we could say, from Najaf. Well, I mean, it came from the 7th Imam, but it was transmitted by Tusi to his students, who then went to different schools in different parts of the world after they've graduated from Najaf. They went to Ray, they went to Jurjan, they went to different parts of the Muslim world. These are different parts of Iran where they had various madaris, various hawzat at that time. We could call them hawzat, madaris, schools of religious learning. And these were the great students of Sheikh Tusi that migrated to different parts of the Muslim world. And in there, they had different centers of learning in different parts of the Muslim world at that time. This is 1100 years ago, okay? Long time back, or 1,000 years ago. And in those various centers of learning, whether it be in Mashhad, whether it be even in Samarkand, whether it be Samarkand, which is closer to Pakistan, to the eastern part of the Muslim world, whether it be in Ray, in Jurjan, Nishapur, on and on and on. There's different, Ray means southern Tehran, Baghdad, and on and on. What is a part of the curriculum in these various centers of learning? Dua and ziyarat is a part of that curriculum, which is a part of the formative foundations of Twelver Shia scholarly identity.
Yes.
So this evidence can be procured through looking at original manuscripts. Original manuscripts indicate this, right? I'll give an example here of a book that I have, just so the viewers can get an idea of what I'm talking about here. This is the first page of the 502 manuscript. They won't be able to decipher it, but alhamdulillah, I've deciphered it with numerous scholars of Islamic manuscripts. So can you see the title there, Misbah al-Mutahajjid, somewhere there?
We can't see the text, but we can see the image quite well, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so you can see the image there.
Yeah.
Light up here, yeah. So
yeah, now it's a bit clearer, yeah.
So this is the title page of Misbah al-Mutahajjid.
MashaAllah.
Copied in the year 502 Hijrah. The title page contains the names of the scholars from that period and later who taught it to one another. Among them are the descendants of Sheikh Saduq, which indicates that this book of dua was not only a book of supplication, a book of personal supplication, but it was a book of teaching.
Yeah.
Which demonstrates to us the juhud and effort and that the great scholars like Ibn Idris al-Hilli, like Sheikh Tusi, like Alam al-Hilli, Shahid al-Thani, and on and on. I mean, these are just a few of the names, Shaykh al-Bahai, and on and on. Alamat al-Majlisi at a later period with Shaykh al-Bahai. The vast effort that the doctors of Twelver Shiism put into the compilation, the study, the teaching, and the meticulous copying of these texts. And these would be considered the maraja of those days. The Shaykh Tusi would be considered like a marja, like the Ayatollah Sistani of his day. Alama Hindi, no doubt, would be like the, Sayyid Muhsin al-Hakim of his day. Ibn Idris would be considered like the Ayatollah al-Burajurdi of his day. Or Sayyid Abul Hasan al-Isfahani, or Naini, or people of this, or Mirza Shirazi, and on, or Ayatollah Khomeini, so on and so forth. These were giants of Islamic spirituality, Islamic law, Islamic theology, who invested their efforts and their time also in the compilation, the teaching, and the study of dua and ziyarat literature.
MashaAllah. I think that was a lot of interesting information then, beneficial information, MashaAllah. I don't know if we have much time. We have 5 minutes left. You did mention Shaykh Tusi a couple of times. I don't know if we have time to delve into that topic, but just as I don't know if we have 5 minutes to say, but who is Shaykh, who was Shaykh Tusi, and what is his legacy in regards to devotional literature?
Yeah, so Shaykh Tusi was the compiler of 2 of the 4 books known as Kutub al-Arba'a, or the 4 books of Hadith, which became the 4 primary books of Hadith, and 2 of them are Al-Istibsar and Tahdhib al-Ahkam. Shaykh Tusi was a successor of Shaykh al-Mufid in Baghdad in the 5th century, where he became the chief alim and scholar of the Shia community in Iraq. And he was in Baghdad. He, as I said, was a successor to Shaykh al-Mufid and Sharif al-Murtada, Alam al-Huda, and Sharif al-Radi, the compiler of Nahj al-Balagha. He was in the city of Baghdad. He became the chief Shia scholar of Baghdad. His library and offices were stormed during Sunni Shia riots, or we would say really anti-Shia violence. Some traditions say even his chair was thrown into the river in Baghdad. The books were burned and thrown away. Thousands and thousands of books were lost. He migrated from Baghdad to Ghari, which was a name before Najaf, or Kufa, Ghari, where he established a center of learning, continued his teaching near the shrine of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He's now buried there. The Masjid Tusi is there. There's Baba Tusi, the door of Tusi, Masjid Tusi. He's buried there. He was a prolific foundational scholar of Shia Islam in articulating the concepts of the Imama, of theology, of Islamic law, and dua and ziyarat literature, as we know. He was also Mufassir of the Quran, wrote probably the first comprehensive tafsir known as al-Tibyan, which is in 10 volumes. And he was a man that went through profound struggle and profound hardship. But he continued to lead the Shia community, and it was his students, along with his son and his students, among them his son, Abi Ali Tusi, who continued his legacy and spread the message of Tashayyu, and continued teaching the traditions of the Imams to different parts of the Muslim world. Like I said, Jurjan, Ray, and other places. He was an absolutely foundational, fundamental piece of the development of Shia identity, of Imami identity, and Imami scholarship. And we get the book Misbah al-Mutahajjid from him, which is that first book of Dua and Ziyarat, that first kind of devotional manual, the first surviving devotional manual from him. And that's why the manual is important, and the person who compiled it is extremely important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think, you've given us so much beneficial information today, and we really do, wish we had more time to discuss many of the other aspects. But is there any last closing remarks before we end off the show?
I would just say that Twelver Shiism is unique for its love of supplication, the richness, both the textual history and the content of the supplications are so rich that, you know, I think anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim, faith or no, I mean, someone of faith rather, anyone of faith, I think, would appreciate it.
Absolutely. Is your dissertation available for everyone to read? Because I was reading it last night and it was really, really beneficial. I don't know if it's available for others to read, but there is.
Yeah, it is available on an archive, but inshallah, the published edition will come out soon, inshallah.
Yeah. Inshallah. But there was so much, I think, for all the viewers watching at home, I hope they've benefited from this interesting discussion. I know you have so much more to discuss, but inshallah, in the coming series, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much. Yeah. For the audience watching at home, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found today's episode beneficial. Dua, supplication, is a daily part of our life, and it's with us throughout our life. And it's good to read about the history, its origins, and many of the other important aspects connected to dua and supplication to get a more deeper understanding of dua literature. I hope today you've benefited from today's episode, and inshallah, please do join us in the next episode of They Ask You. Inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hussein.